My wife's 70th birthday was supposed to be the warmest night of her life. But inside a crowded mansion in the Hamptons, my daughter-in-law stood up, looked straight at my wife, and said one sentence that froze the entire room. "She doesn't deserve to receive a gift." I was holding a small family keepsake in my hand. No one said a word. It was like every mouth in that room had been shut at the same time. The strangest part was not what she said. It was the fact that my son nodded in agreement. If you're listening to this story and felt something was wrong from that very moment, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Because what happened next was not just a ruined party. It was the moment I realized my family had been quietly changing for a very long time. I remember that moment very clearly, because after that sentence, the room was no longer a party. It became a test. No one spoke. No one moved. Crystal glasses were still raised, but no one drank. The music kept playing steady and polite, as if it hadn't noticed that something had just broken. I looked at my wife. Alice stood there with her hands folded in front of her stomach, her back slightly bent. Her eyes were not searching for pity. She was only looking down at the small gift box in my hand. An old wooden box, the edges worn smooth. Inside was my father's pocket watch. The only thing I kept after the war and the years of scarcity. I planned to give it to her that night. Not for its value, but as a thank you for a lifetime of standing beside me. But Victoria stopped me, as if I were doing something wrong. She stood very straight. A light-colored evening gown, the lights reflecting off a face used to cameras. Her voice did not shake. No anger, just cold calculation presented to the crowd like an obvious conclusion. That my wife had received too much. That giving her anything more would be a waste. I waited for my son to speak. Harrison stood right next to her. The suit I bought him fit perfectly. The watch on his wrist was my birthday gift to him last year. I waited for him to look at his mother. Or at least, to look at me. He didn't. He only nodded, very lightly, like approving an unnecessary expense. In that moment I understood this was not a careless remark. It was a decision made long in advance. I paid for the party, but Harrison's name was listed as the host. He told me he wanted to surprise Mom. I believed him. I have always believed my son. Maybe because I was used to trusting the things I built myself. I never imagined that would become the bitterest irony of the night. Just minutes earlier, Harrison had given Victoria a diamond necklace. He announced its value casually, like reporting an achievement. The guests applauded. Cameras went up. Victoria smiled, touched her neck, and enjoyed the moment, as if it were well-deserved. Alice applauded too. She always applauds for other people's happiness, even when it has nothing to do with her. I noticed the arrangement when I looked around the room. Harrison's business friends, Victoria's partners, faces familiar with parties but unfamiliar with our family. No one from the hard years. No one who had seen Alice sit up all night by our son's bed. No one who knew she sold her own jewelry to help Harrison start his first business. Those people were not invited, perhaps because they would not understand the logic of that evening. After Victoria spoke, a few people lowered their heads and pretended to check their phones. Others leaned in to whisper. No one objected. The silence spread quickly, like a room with all the windows shut on a hot night. Stifling, but no one dared to open them. Alice did not cry. That hurt me more. She took a deep breath as if reminding herself to stay upright. I saw her hand tremble slightly, then tighten again. She turned to me, her eyes calm, and quietly said she was tired. That was all. No accusations. No questions. Not a single word of defense. I put the wooden box back into my coat pocket, very slowly, so no one could say I lost my temper. I took my wife's hand. It was thinner than I remembered, but still warm. We walked out of the hall between rows of guests, trying to look polite. The music continued behind us, as if our presence from the beginning had been nothing more than a detail that could be erased. When the doors closed, I heard laughter return. Not mocking laughter. Just the laughter of people who had decided that what just happened had nothing to do with them. In the car, Alice looked out the window. The lights of the Hamptons slid past slowly. She said maybe she had troubled everyone for too long. That sentence made me turn my face away. I did not want her to see what was forming inside me at that moment. I said nothing, not because I had nothing to say, but because I knew that if I spoke, I would say things I should not. And I understood then. From that moment on, this story was no longer about a birthday party. It was about who was considered worthy, and who had been quietly making that decision for a very long time. That night, when the house was left with nothing but the steady hum of the air conditioner, I sat alone in my study. Alice had gone to bed earlier than usual, not because she was tired, but because she did not want to keep thinking. I understood that. Some pain, when you refuse to look at it, will stay quiet for a while. I couldn't do that. I opened the bottom drawer of the old wooden desk. Inside were folders I thought I would never need again. Purchase records, ownership papers, contracts signed back when Harrison had not even finished college. Back then he told me he wanted to stand on his own 2 feet. I believed him, but I still stayed behind the scenes, quietly laying the foundation. I went through each file, slowly. An old habit from a man who once lived by numbers and blueprints. If something is wrong, it always leaves a trace. The question is whether you have the patience to find it. Near midnight, I saw it, a bank notice from 3 months earlier. At that time, Alice and I were in Europe for routine health checkups. The message was brief, but it was enough to make me sit up straight. A property in Florida. The vacation home we bought after I retired, used as collateral. Primary signer, Harrison. Co-signer, Victoria. I read it again, then again. Not because I didn't understand, but because I needed to be sure I wasn't imagining it. I opened the attached contract copies. My name appeared at the bottom of the page, but the handwriting was not mine. Too round, too rushed. An imitation. The room was so quiet, I could hear my own breathing. The next morning I said nothing to Alice, not because I wanted to hide it, but because I needed certainty. I called the bank as the primary owner. The voice on the other end was polite, professional. They confirmed the mortgage had been released to restructure the finances of Fielding Innovations, Harrison's company. I thanked them and hung up. I didn't ask more. Questions at that moment would only blur things. I needed the full picture. It took me 2 days to gather everything. Financial reports Harrison had never sent me. Overlapping short-term loans. Commitments to investors I had never heard about. The company was not growing the way Victoria's social media posts claimed. It was slipping. Slowly, but steadily, and the house in Florida was only one lifeline. On the 3rd evening I sat down beside Alice. She was folding clothes in the bedroom. Her movements were slow, as if every fold required thought. I told her there was something we needed to talk about. She looked at me with a familiar expression. The look of someone who had lived with me for more than 40 years, and knew when things were no longer simple. When I finished, Alice did not react right away. She placed the shirt down and sat quietly for a long time. Then she asked very softly, "Did he ask permission?" I shook my head. She nodded, as if she had already known. No anger, no tears, just a tired acceptance. She said maybe we had indulged Harrison for too long, that maybe in his eyes we were no longer parents, but a backup resource. That sentence took me back to the party. The way Harrison talked about cutting costs, the way Victoria stepped in to deliver the final judgment, everything began to fall into place, piece by piece, cold and clear. Alice said she felt ashamed, not because of the public humiliation, but because she hadn't seen it sooner. She wondered if she had done something wrong by always supporting our son. I told her it was not her fault, but I did not deny that some silences had lasted too long. That night, Alice cried. For the first time since the birthday party, she cried very quietly, as if afraid of disturbing someone. I sat beside her and said nothing. Sometimes being there is enough. The next morning I made a decision, not in anger, and not for revenge. I decided that if things had been used the wrong way, they needed to be put back in their proper place. But to do that, I could not act like a wounded father. I had to act like someone who understood the rules of the game. I started with silence. I did not call Harrison. I did not message Victoria. I let them believe I had accepted it. My silence to them was probably just a sign of old age. Meanwhile, I kept reading. Every line of every contract, every small clause, things I once trusted others to review for me. This time, I did it myself, and I realized something. Harrison may have signed in my name, but there were rights he never truly owned. Those rights were still in my name. When I closed the final folder, it was already dark outside. Alice stood in the doorway watching me. She asked what I planned to do next. I told her I didn't know everything yet, but I knew one thing. I would not let things continue in silence any longer. Not because of money, but because of boundaries. And because after that birthday party, I understood that if I didn't stand up, no one else would do it for us. After that night, I didn't sleep much, not because of worry, but because my mind had shifted into a different mode. When you spend a lifetime building things that must stand, you learn that panic is useless. Only order gets results. I didn't call Harrison. I didn't respond to the polite messages Victoria sent to Alice either. Short lines. Courteous. Cold enough to pretend the birthday party had never happened. My silence stretched on, and I knew exactly how they would read it. An old father. Tired. Pulling back. I let them believe that. 3 days later, I met Dominic Rossi. His office wasn't in a glamorous building. No large paintings. No glass walls overlooking the city. Just a neat room. White light. The smell of paper and ink. Dominic looked at me for a long moment before speaking. He didn't ask why I was there. He asked how I wanted this to end. I told him I didn't want to destroy my son. I just wanted things to stop where they were supposed to stop. Dominic nodded. He said most people who come to him say the opposite. Then he opened the file, read slowly, and began pointing out what I had felt but hadn't named. Forged signatures, assets used without legal authority, a deliberate blur between personal rights and corporate control. You've kept too much in your name, Dominic said. That's both a risk and an advantage. I understood immediately. From that day on, I entered a phase I later came to think of as a pressured pause. No arguments, no confrontations, just small, precise steps. Dominic sent out the necessary legal notices. I requested an independent audit of Harrison's company as the holder of the original brand ownership. Harrison called me on the 5th day. His voice was still confident, slightly irritated. He asked why certain company account access had been restricted. I said it might be a system error. I suggested he speak with legal. The call ended quickly. He didn't suspect a thing, perhaps because he had never imagined I would do anything other than shield him. Meanwhile, something else surfaced, not through investigation, but through carelessness. Victoria posted too much. Photos, meetings, trips disguised as collaborations. Dominic showed me the connections. Unusual transfers. One name appearing again and again. A direct competitor of Harrison's company. I didn't ask Dominic if it was what I thought it was. I only asked whether what we had was clear enough to stand without argument. He said it was. I didn't tell Alice about that part. Not because I wanted to hide it, but because I didn't want her carrying another layer of disappointment. She had endured enough. She only knew I was sorting out paperwork. And in a way, that was true. A week later, I signed the final decision. Quietly. No announcement. I revoked the right to use the brand I had once lent to Harrison, along with clauses I never thought I'd need. Within hours, the core value of the company was frozen. Investors paused. Partners stepped back. On paper, the company's value dropped to nearly nothing. Harrison called again, this time many calls in a row. I left the phone on the table, let it vibrate, then go silent. I looked at it the way you look at something unfamiliar, not because he was no longer my son, but because I knew that if I answered now, everything I had done would lose its meaning. That evening I came home late. Alice was sitting in the living room. Only half the lights were on. She asked if something was happening. I said some things were revealing themselves, and we no longer needed to chase them. She looked at me a little worried, but didn't ask more. Maybe she had learned that in certain moments waiting is the only choice that doesn't cause more harm. The next morning, Harrison and Victoria appeared at our small apartment door. Unannounced, uninvited, their faces no longer carried their usual confidence. Harrison looked worn down. Victoria looked tense, still trying to hold control. I didn't open the door right away. I let them stand outside for a few minutes, not as punishment, just to give myself time to stand up, straighten my jacket, and prepare for a meeting I knew couldn't be avoided. When I opened the door, they stepped in quickly as if afraid the chance might disappear. Harrison started talking, his voice higher than usual. He spoke about responsibility, about what he deserved. Victoria stayed quieter. Her eyes swept the room as if searching for something that wasn't there. I invited them to sit. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I listened until Harrison paused to take a breath. Then I spoke, very slowly. I said maybe it was time we sat down with the people who were truly involved. Harrison asked who I was talking about. I didn't answer right away. I stood up and opened the door next to my study. Inside, chairs were already arranged, and the people Harrison never imagined he would face like this were waiting. In that moment, I knew the silence I had kept for so long was about to end. And once it ended, nothing would return to the way it had been before. The room wasn't large, but it was quiet enough that every breath could be heard. Harrison froze when he saw the people seated around the long table, familiar faces from board meetings, people he had only ever met through a screen as the one presenting. Tonight they looked at him the way you look at a report waiting to be verified. Victoria stopped at the doorway. She didn't sit down. Her eyes moved quickly from face to face, then paused on Dominic Rossi. I noticed the shift. When someone realizes control has slipped away, the body reacts before the mind does. I closed the door. Gently. No lock. There was no need. Harrison asked what this was supposed to be. I didn't answer. I pulled out a chair and sat at the head of the table. Dominic placed a folder in front of me, squared neatly. I opened it without looking at Harrison, without looking at Victoria. I said that before we went any further, a few things needed to be called by their proper names. I started with the simple facts, the rights Harrison's company was using, the clauses that had been ignored, the signatures that weren't mine but carried my name. I didn't raise my voice. I read each line the way you read an inventory. The silence in the room was no longer passive. It grew heavier by the minute. Harrison reacted first. He said everything had been done to protect the company, that these were decisions made under pressure, that without them, everyone in this room would suffer. He spoke fast, without pause, as if afraid that if he stopped, the story would lose its force. I let him finish. Then I looked at Dominic. He gave a very slight nod. That was all I needed. Dominic placed another set of papers on the table. Not thick, but enough to change the air. He said that beyond the financial issues, there were undisclosed conflicts of interest. He didn't mention Victoria by name, but when he read the name of a competing company, I saw Victoria tighten her grip on her bag strap. Harrison turned to look at her. There was no anger in his eyes, only confusion, as if an assumption he had carried for a long time had just been pulled away. Dominic continued. Calm, methodical, recorded meetings, transfers unrelated to any official role, internal information being shared, no accusations, just facts placed side by side allowed to speak for themselves. Victoria cut in. She said it was all a misunderstanding, that she had been seeking partnerships to save the company. Her voice was still sharp, but the confidence was gone. I looked at her, and for the first time through all of this, I spoke directly. I said that if this was salvation, then it was the kind that closed every remaining door. Harrison shook his head as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. He asked why I was doing this in front of everyone, why I hadn't spoken to him privately. I told him that when decisions are made in front of too many people, the truth deserves to be placed where it belongs. I looked straight at him. I said that on his mother's birthday night, when he nodded at those words, he chose a public moment. Tonight was simply the consequence. No one interrupted. The shareholders flipped through pages, exchanged glances. No further explanation was needed. The numbers were clear. The timelines were convincing. Dominic stated that under the current conditions, Harrison was no longer fit to remain in charge. Temporary authority was transferred. The vote happened quickly, quietly. No debate. The result was recorded as procedure. Harrison sank into his chair. For the first time, I saw his shoulders drop, not because of lost money, but because he had lost a position he believed was guaranteed. Victoria stood up. She said this was betrayal, that I was destroying my own family. I looked at her and spoke a sentence I had held onto since the birthday night. I said that when she stood in the middle of that ballroom and decided who was worthy, she had broken it first. She fell silent. The meeting ended shortly after. The shareholders left one by one, nodding to me out of courtesy. No one stayed to comfort Harrison. No one blamed him. This had been handled the way people who understand consequences expect. When only the three of us remained, the room felt hollow. Harrison stood and looked at me for a long time. He asked if I still considered him my son. I said that had never changed. But other things had. I told him that when he said his mother didn't deserve a gift, he had also raised a question about what he himself deserved to carry. I said that with the way he had acted, he did not deserve to carry the Fielding name as a shield. The sentence didn't need emphasis. It landed on its own. Harrison turned away. Victoria followed. The door closed. This time, the sound was clear. I stayed seated alone in the room, now too quiet. I didn't feel victorious, only that something necessary had ended. When I got home, Alice was waiting. She didn't ask what had happened. I only said that everything had been laid bare. She nodded and placed her hand over mine. In that moment, I understood the hardest part was over. What remained was how we would choose to live with whatever came next. After that evening, our house grew quiet in a different way. Not the tense silence of things left unsaid, but the calm of a chapter finally closing. Alice woke up later than usual. She made tea, sat by the window, watched the morning light spill across the garden. There were no more questions, no more assumptions held inside. Harrison didn't come back. Neither did Victoria. I didn't look for them. I didn't avoid them either. I let distance do what distance does best. The decisions had already been recorded. On paper, with signatures, with legal consequences. The rest was theirs to live with. In the weeks that followed, Dominic helped me finish what needed to be done. The transfer of management went smoothly. Harrison officially left the company he once called his life's work. Victoria withdrew from every related role. The press wrote a few short pieces. Enough for people in the industry to understand. Not enough to turn it into noise. I didn't read them. I didn't need to. What occupied my thoughts was Alice. After everything, she didn't seem relieved in the way people expect. She was quieter, but not closed off. One afternoon, she told me she had been thinking about people who aren't as fortunate as we are. Older people without clear records, without lawyers they trust, without anyone to stand up for them when they are treated like a burden. She said she had been thinking about it since her birthday night. We began meeting with a few community organizations. Very quietly. No announcements. No names attached. We listened. Stories that didn't need retelling to be moving. They were heavy enough on their own. Savings being managed for them. Signatures being helped along. Homes being temporarily used. Alice sat beside me during those meetings, a small notebook in her hands. She took careful notes, not like a charity donor, but like someone who understands that without boundaries the same patterns will repeat. We decided to start a fund. Not large, not flashy, just enough to provide basic legal support and financial guidance for older people facing quiet exploitation. Alice named it Alice's Grace. I asked her why. She said the greatest gift isn't money. It's being reminded that you still have value. On the day the fund was announced, there was no ribbon cutting, just a short statement. I stood in the back row and watched Alice speak a few simple lines. She didn't mention family. She didn't mention the past. She only said that if anyone felt they were not worthy of being heard, this fund existed to prove otherwise. That evening we boarded a ship. A short trip, no packed schedule. The deck was wide. The air was cool. Alice wore a light jacket and rested her head on my shoulder. The sea stretched out in front of us. No explanations needed. I realized how long it had been since we could sit like this, without obligations, without expectations, without making decisions for other people. My phone vibrated. I looked at the screen. Harrison! I wasn't surprised. I wasn't angry. I held the phone for a moment, then placed it face down beside an unfinished cocktail. I took Alice's hand. She didn't ask who was calling. Perhaps she already knew. We looked toward the horizon. The ship's lights reflected softly on the water. I thought about that sentence at the birthday party, about who deserves a gift. In the end, I understood something. The greatest gifts are not found in boxes handed out before a crowd. They are found in knowing when to stop and when to open something new. Family to me is no longer a place for negotiating favors. It's a place where you learn to say enough without raising your voice. If you treat your parents' love as guaranteed, you will eventually learn the cost of loneliness, not through punishment, but through the emptiness you create yourself. Alice squeezed my hand. She said she felt lighter. I nodded. The ship kept cutting through the water, steady and calm, and for the first time in a long while, I knew we were heading in the right direction. Not to leave anyone behind, but to return to ourselves. Thank you for listening to this story. If it made you think, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it so stories like this can reach more people. The lesson I learned is simple. Parents do not raise children to become a backup plan, and family is not a place to weigh profit and loss. If you learn to value the people who stood beside you when you had nothing, you won't have to regret it when everything else is already too late.